Christmas morning, 34 years old, and I'm still trying to understand how my parents measure love. My brother Jake, fresh out of college with a business degree he barely earned, unwraps his graduation present, a brand new BMW 3 Series that costs more than most people make in a year. $40,000 of metallic blue validation, complete with leather seats, and the kind of unconditional approval I'd been chasing my entire life. The neighbors come out to admire it. Mom takes pictures for Facebook. Dad beams like he's just solved world hunger instead of buying his 22-year-old son a car that screams you'll never have to work as hard as your sister. Meanwhile, I'm standing there with my law degree, my six-figure salary, my spotless credit score, and my decade of never asking them for anything, watching my parents celebrate Jake's mediocrity like it's a Nobel Prize. Then Mom slips me a folded $10 bill. "This will teach you responsibility, Addison," she whispers, like I'm still 12 and need lessons about money management. $10. For the daughter who put herself through law school. For the child who'd never gotten a graduation party, a new car, or even acknowledgement that maybe working 3 jobs while maintaining a 4 gigapascals deserved something more than a lecture about responsibility. That morning, I realized I wasn't their daughter. I was their cautionary tale, the proof that hard work doesn't guarantee love, success doesn't earn respect, and some families will always find reasons why you deserve less than everyone else. Standing in that driveway, watching Jake rev an engine paid for by parents who'd never offered me so much as gas money, I made a decision that would change everything. If $10 was all I was worth to them, I'd show them what building a life on your own was actually worth. My name is Addison White, 34 now, but that Christmas morning I was 22, still believing family meant fairness, still clinging to scraps of affection that always seemed rationed in portions I'd never learned to calculate or predict. Growing up in suburban Greenwich, Connecticut, I'd spent 2 decades trying to decode the mathematics of parental love in our 4-bedroom colonial, where my brother Jake was always the featured attraction, and I was perpetually the opening act nobody paid attention to. The pattern started early and never wavered. At 12, Jake got a leather baseball glove that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, Wilson A. 2000, professional grade. The kind that made other kids on his little league team stare with envy. I got a 3-pack of socks from the Target clearance rack because Addison needs to learn the value of practical gifts. At 16, Jake got driving lessons from a certified instructor, Saturday morning sessions that cost $60 per hour while Dad sat in the passenger seat offering encouragement and advice about parallel parking and highway merging. I got told to take the bus and save money when I asked about learning to drive, as if transportation was a luxury rather than a necessity for someone who'd just landed her first after-school job. At 18, Jake's college tuition was already covered. Dad had been contributing to a 529 plan since Jake turned 5, discussing investment strategies and compound interest like he was preparing for his son's financial future with the dedication of a portfolio manager. I got handed a stack of student loan applications and told that earning your education builds character while Jake's character was apparently strong enough already to deserve a debt-free start to adulthood. The family living room that Christmas morning looked like a shrine to Jake's achievements. His graduation photos covered the mantelpiece, cap and gown ceremonies from high school, college acceptance letters displayed in frames, soccer trophies that had accumulated dust but never moved from their positions of honor on built-in bookshelves. My achievements lived in a shoebox in my childhood bedroom. Dean's List certificates, scholarship notifications, academic awards that had been acknowledged with brief nods, and then forgotten as conversations inevitably returned to whatever Jake was accomplishing, with half the effort I'd been putting in since elementary school. The sound of that BMW engine revving in our driveway echoed through the house like thunder, drowning out every other noise. Holiday music playing from speakers in the kitchen, relatives chattering about their own Christmas hauls, Mom organizing gift wrapping paper with the efficiency of someone who'd never questioned whether love should be distributed equally among children who'd both earned it. Jake sat behind the wheel like he'd been born for luxury, adjusting mirrors and testing features while aunts and uncles gathered around the car taking pictures for Facebook albums that would document this moment as evidence of successful parenting and family prosperity. "Look at that smile," Mom gushed, her voice carrying the kind of maternal pride I'd heard directed at Jake's accomplishments since we were kids. but had never recognized in conversations about my own achievements. He deserves this. He's worked so hard. Worked so hard. Jake, who'd changed majors 3 times, graduated with a 2.8 gigapascals, and spent most of college playing video games while I was working 3 part-time jobs to cover expenses that his trust fund handled automatically. Meanwhile, I stood in our living room clutching that crumpled $10 bill, its edges growing damp from the sweat of my palm as I watched relatives celebrate a gift that cost more than I'd made working retail during my entire senior year of high school. The money felt different in my hand than it should have, not like a gift, but like evidence of how little thought had gone into determining what the daughter deserved compared to what the son had earned simply by existing. $10, hastily folded, presented without ceremony or explanation beyond a whispered lesson about responsibility that I'd apparently still needed to learn despite managing my own finances since age 16. My role in our family portrait had been established years earlier and never revised, the responsible one, the one who managed disappointment with grace, the background character who made everyone else's achievements look more impressive by contrast. While Jake was encouraged to dream big and reach for possibilities, I was trained to be grateful for whatever attention remained after his needs had been met. Every child learns what love costs in their family's economy. Some families distribute it equally, recognizing that each child deserves investment in their potential. Others operate on scarcity models where affection and resources are allocated based on favoritism disguised as merit. That Christmas morning, standing in a living room filled with relatives celebrating Jake's $40,000 validation, while I held $10 and a lecture about financial responsibility, I finally calculated my exact worth in our family's ledger. I was the clearance daughter, available at a 99% discount, practical rather than precious, useful for teaching lessons about gratitude, while never receiving lessons about deserving better treatment from people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The kitchen sink became my refuge that Christmas morning, cold porcelain against my palms while snow drifted past windows that framed a perfect suburban tableau of family prosperity I'd never be allowed to truly share. I stood there tracing that $10 bill with fingertips that had grown numb from more than winter air, feeling its cheap paper fibers like sandpaper against skin that had learned to absorb disappointment without flinching. $10, hastily folded, edges soft from being carried in Mom's purse next to grocery lists and discount coupons, the same casual attention she'd given to selecting my Christmas gift. Through the kitchen window, I could see Jake and his new BMW, engine purring with the satisfaction of $40,000 worth of validation, while relatives gathered around like he was visiting royalty, instead of a 22-year-old who'd never worked a day for anything he'd received. The metallic blue paint caught winter sunlight like captured sky, reflecting everything I'd never been allowed to dream about having. Mom waved from the driveway with the enthusiasm she reserved for Jake's achievements, her face glowing with maternal pride that had never once been directed at my academic successes, my work ethic, my years of asking for nothing while watching him receive everything. She took pictures with her phone, already crafting the Facebook post that would celebrate Jake's graduation gift while I remained invisible in our family's public narrative. My reflection in that kitchen window looked like a ghost haunting someone else's life, pale, insubstantial, existing in the margins of a story where I'd never been cast as anything more than background scenery. 22 years old, honor roll graduate, working 2 jobs to afford law school, and still standing in my parents' kitchen wondering why my achievements felt weightless compared to Jake's effortless accumulation of rewards. Dad's footsteps creaked across hardwood floors as he joined me in the kitchen, his presence filling the space with the kind of paternal authority that had spent decades explaining why I deserved less than everyone else in our family without ever questioning whether that inequality might be wrong. "Addison," he said, his voice carrying the tone he used when delivering life lessons he believed would build character through systematic disappointment. "I know you might be feeling envious about Jake's gift, but you need to understand something important." Envious. The word sat between us like an accusation, suggesting that my reaction to watching $40,000 of love being distributed to my brother while I received $10 and a lecture was somehow petty rather than rational. "Money isn't given," he continued, leaning against the kitchen counter with the casual confidence of someone who'd never questioned his own logic. "It's earned." Jake worked hard for his degree, and this car represents recognition of that achievement. You should be grateful for what you've got instead of comparing yourself to others. grateful for what I'd got. $10 and a lesson about financial responsibility from a man who'd just spent more than most people's annual salary on a car for his son, who'd graduated with grades that wouldn't have qualified him for the core scholarship programs I'd earned through 4 years of straight A's. Jake worked hard? The words escaped before I could stop them, my voice carrying surprise that sounded like challenge even though I'd meant it as genuine question. Dad, I graduated summa cum laude. I worked 3 jobs during college. I've never asked you for money, never missed a payment on my student loans, never needed you to bail me out of anything. His expression shifted into the patient disappointment he wore whenever I failed to accept family dynamics that everyone else had learned not to question. That's exactly what I mean about being grateful, Addison. You've learned to be self-sufficient, which is a valuable life skill. Jake needs more support right now as he transitions into the real world. The real world. As if the world I'd been living in, working retail jobs to pay for textbooks, eating ramen noodles to afford law school applications, taking public transportation because I couldn't afford car payments, had been some kind of practice simulation while Jake prepared for actual adulting with the help of a BMW and unlimited parental funding. Besides, Dad added, his voice taking on the tone that meant this conversation was concluding whether I'd received satisfactory answers or not, you're the responsible one in the family. You don't need material things to motivate you. That's your strength. My strength. Being the child who required less attention, less investment, less celebration because I'd been trained since childhood to manage disappointment with grace, while watching my brother collect rewards for achievements that paled compared to mine. My strength was being strong enough to not need what everyone else received, reliable enough to not require what others demanded, resilient enough to thrive on scraps while others feasted on abundance. I looked down at that $10 bill, its wrinkled surface reflecting kitchen lights that had witnessed thousands of conversations where my accomplishments were minimized and Jake's mediocrity was celebrated. The money felt heavier than it should have, weighted with meaning that went far beyond its purchasing power. It wasn't about the $10. It wasn't even about the BMW, though watching Jake rev an engine I'd never be able to afford did sting in ways I was still learning to articulate. It was about recognition, about value, about finally understanding that family love isn't always unconditional, sometimes it's transactional, and the exchange rate had never been calculated in my favor. Standing in that kitchen while my family celebrated in the driveway, I realized I'd been operating under false assumptions about how affection was distributed in our household. I'd believed that working harder would eventually earn more recognition, that achieving more would eventually generate more pride, that being the responsible child would eventually result in being the valued child. But responsibility, I was learning, wasn't a currency that could be exchanged for the kind of love Jake received automatically. It was a burden that justified giving me less while expecting me to be grateful for the privilege of carrying weight that others were never asked to lift. The $10 bill crumpled slightly in my palm as I closed my fingers around evidence of exactly what my 22 years of being the perfect daughter had purchased in our family's economy of affection. Not much, it turned out, not nearly enough. Outside the window, Jake was still revving his engine, still accepting congratulations, still living in the warm glow of parental approval that I'd spent 2 decades trying to earn and would apparently never receive regardless of what I achieved or how perfectly I managed every disappointment they delivered. That Christmas morning, holding $10 and a lesson about gratitude, I finally understood that some equations would never balance no matter how hard you worked to solve them. The house settled into post-holiday silence at 2:17 a.m., Connecticut snow tapping against windows like fingers drumming impatiently while my family slept off their Christmas dinner and BMW celebration, completely unaware that the daughter they'd valued at $10 was about to disappear from their lives forever. I packed in darkness, not because I was ashamed of leaving, but because I didn't want to risk anyone waking up and trying to talk me out of a decision that had crystallized the moment Dad explained why being reliable meant deserving less. 1 pair of jeans, 2 sweaters, my second-hand Dell laptop that had survived 3 years of law school research, and textbooks that represented more intellectual achievement than Jake had accumulated in his entire academic career. That crumpled $10 bill went into my front pocket, not as spending money but as evidence, a reminder of exactly how my family had appraised my worth after 22 years of straight A's, perfect attendance, and never asking for anything they weren't already planning to give Jake. My childhood bedroom looked different in the darkness. familiar furniture transformed into shadows of a life I was choosing to leave behind. The shoebox of academic awards still sat on my desk, certificates and scholarship letters that documented achievements my parents had never celebrated because they'd been too busy planning Jake's next reward for meeting their significantly lower expectations. The hardest part wasn't packing. It was walking past Jake's room and seeing his BMW keys on his nightstand, reflecting streetlight that filtered through curtains he'd never had to close to hide disappointment. Those keys represented everything I'd never received from our parents, not just the car, but the message it carried about whose dreams deserved funding and whose hard work deserved celebration. I carried my backpack downstairs through a house that had never truly been home, past family photos where Jake's achievements occupied center stage, while my accomplishments lived in the margins. Each step creaked like a countdown to freedom, floorboards that had absorbed decades of unequal treatment, finally witnessing someone who refused to accept their assigned role in our family's hierarchy. The front door opened silently. I'd learned to navigate our house without drawing attention years ago, when my late-night studying had been criticized as inconsiderate, while Jake's video game marathons had been ignored as typical teenage behavior. Connecticut winter air hit my face like clarity, sharp and clean and free from the suffocating atmosphere of conditional love that had defined every interaction in our household. Jake's BMW sat in our driveway like a monument to favoritism, its metallic blue paint catching Christmas lights that would blink until New Year's, while I'd be building a life in places where my value wasn't determined by comparison to someone else's mediocrity. $40,000 of validation? Parked next to the spot where I'd learned to parallel park using our neighbor's cones because my parents couldn't afford driving lessons for both children, only the one whose success they'd decided mattered. The midnight bus to New York City waited at Greenwich Station like salvation disguised as public transportation. The driver barely looked up as I climbed aboard with my backpack and $10 bill that wouldn't cover much more than a subway ride, but would serve as the foundation for proving that sometimes the child who receives the least gives herself the most. Other passengers slept or stared out windows at suburban Connecticut sliding past in darkness, towns full of families who probably distributed love more equitably than mine, households where achievement was celebrated regardless of which child accomplished it. I pressed my forehead against cold glass and watched streetlights blur into stars that looked like possibilities instead of limitations. I wasn't running away. Running implies escape from something you're afraid to face. I was walking towards something, toward a life where my accomplishments wouldn't be minimized to make someone else's mediocrity look impressive, where my resilience wouldn't be used to justify giving me less while expecting me to be grateful for scraps. If $10 was all they thought I deserved after 22 years of being the perfect daughter, then I'd multiply it until the world recognized what they'd been too blind to see. Not through anger or revenge, but through the same work ethic that had earned me scholarships they'd never acknowledged and academic honors they'd never celebrated. The bus pulled away from Greenwich at 2:43 a.m., carrying me toward Manhattan, where millions of people had built lives that didn't require approval from families who'd failed to appreciate them. Snow swirled past windows like confetti celebrating my independence, each flake a reminder that some storms clear the air instead of clouding it. Behind us, my family home shrank into darkness, taking with it 22 years of believing that love should be earned through perfection, that family meant accepting unequal treatment with grace, that being strong enough to survive disappointment somehow justified receiving more of it. The Connecticut colonial where I'd grown up became just another house in a town full of families I no longer had to understand or forgive or accommodate. Jake would wake up to his BMW and his trust fund and his parents' continued celebration of achievements that paled compared to what his sister had accomplished with zero support and maximum expectation of gratitude for receiving less. But his success story was no longer mine to witness or subsidize through my own diminished expectations. My life, finally, completely, unapologetically mine, was beginning with a $10 bill and the understanding that sometimes walking away from people who undervalue you is the first step toward finding people who see your worth. The city lights of Manhattan grew larger through the bus windows, promising opportunities that wouldn't require family approval. Achievements that could be celebrated without comparison to someone else's lesser accomplishments, and a future where my value wouldn't be negotiable based on whose child I was. At 22, with $10 and a law degree I'd earned through my own determination, I was about to discover what happened when the child who'd been treated like she was worth the least proved she was actually worth the most. New York City at 22 with $10 and a backpack teaches you mathematics that no business school covers, how to stretch a dollar until it screams, how to calculate dignity when you're counting quarters for subway fare, how to multiply hope when the odds are divided against you. The first year was survival disguised as ambition. I waited tables at Rosario's on the Lower East Side, a family-owned Italian place where the owner's wife took pity on the girl who worked double shifts without complaining and never called in sick because sick days were luxuries I couldn't afford. My hands learned to balance 4 plates up each arm while my mind calculated tips that meant the difference between eating dinner and skipping it. Every dollar earned felt like vindication. Every quarter saved was proof that the daughter they'd valued at $10 possessed financial discipline they'd never bothered to teach or acknowledge. I kept receipts for everything, not for taxes, but as evidence that I could build something substantial from the scraps they'd decided represented my worth. My first apartment was a studio in Chinatown that smelled like fish from the market downstairs, and had plaster so cracked it looked like a map of everything that had fallen apart in my life, before I'd learned to put it back together. Myself. 600 square feet that required first month, last month, and security deposit, money I'd earned serving pasta to tourists, while studying business textbooks I'd bought used from graduating seniors who'd had the luxury of parental funding. The lease signing was a ceremony they'd never witness. Signing my name without co-signers, proving creditworthiness they'd never helped me establish, claiming space in a city that didn't care what my family thought I deserved. My signature on that rental agreement felt heavier than any diploma, proof that I could build security without permission from people who'd confused love with conditional approval. Nights blended into a montage of determination that would have made a better movie than it did a lived experience. Vending machine dinners eaten by streetlight because my apartment's electricity had been turned off for late payment. Studying marketing strategies on borrowed textbooks while sirens wailed through windows that didn't quite close, promising myself that this grinding poverty was temporary, that every sacrifice was investment in a future my family couldn't imagine. "This won't be forever," became my mantra, whispered to cockroaches that shared my studio and doubt that shared my bed. Words spoken to reflection in bathroom mirrors that had witnessed more determination than most boardrooms, more planning than most corner offices, more strategic thinking than most people with trust funds would ever need to develop. The freelance gigs started small, helping restaurant owners organize their books, writing marketing copy for businesses that couldn't afford proper agencies, consulting for startups that paid in equity and promises. But each handshake carried respect I'd never received at family dinners, recognition of value that had nothing to do with whose child I was, or how my achievements compared to my brother's lesser accomplishments. My first real client was Maria Santos, who owned 3 laundromats in Brooklyn, and needed someone who understood both numbers and neighborhoods. She paid me $800 to reorganize her business model, more money than I'd ever held at one time, earned through knowledge I'd accumulated waiting tables while other people my age were spending their parents' money on spring break trips. "You're different than other consultants," Maria told me, handing over a check that felt like validation printed on bank paper. "You understand what it means to build something from nothing. You get why every dollar matters." That $10 bill lived in my wallet like a talisman, growing more fragile with each month but never discarded. Its edges softened and tore, the ink faded until the numbers were barely visible, but I kept it as fuel rather than currency, reminder of exactly how wrong they'd been about my potential, evidence of the starting point that would make my eventual success even more meaningful. By 26, I was consulting for businesses that had never heard of Greenwich, Connecticut, or BMW graduation gifts, or families who distributed love based on favoritism disguised as merit. My clients cared about results, not bloodlines. They measured success in profit margins, not parental approval. They paid for expertise, not genetic lottery tickets. The breakthrough came when I landed a contract with Meridian Holdings, a private equity firm that needed someone who could evaluate small businesses with the perspective of someone who'd actually built something from scratch. They'd heard about the consultant who'd helped 3 laundromats become a regional chain, who'd transformed a struggling restaurant into a franchise operation, who understood both poverty and profit because she'd lived in both worlds. The conference room where I pitched Meridian was 40 floors above the streets where I'd waited tables, glass walls overlooking a city that had adopted me when my family had appraised me at clearance prices. 23 people in expensive suits listened to presentations from consultants with MBA credentials from schools my parents had never considered important enough to fund. But they chose me, not despite my background but because of it. Because I understood businesses that started with nothing, because I could speak to entrepreneurs who'd built success from determination rather than inheritance, because my recommendations came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The contract was worth $1.2 million over 18 months. More money than my father had spent on both his children's education combined, more than Jake's BMW and trust fund and every advantage he'd received for achieving mediocrity with maximum support. I signed that contract with the same pen I'd used to sign my first apartment lease, sitting in a boardroom that overlooked the Lower East Side where I'd counted quarters for subway fare while building expertise worth more than my family had ever imagined possible. By 29, White Consulting occupied office space in Midtown Manhattan, with employees who'd never heard the story about Christmas morning inequality, but who respected the boss who understood both struggle and success because she'd earned both through her own determination. My business cards read founder and CEO, titles my family had never considered appropriate for the daughter who'd been trained to be grateful for scraps. By 31, I'd signed consulting contracts worth more than 8 figures annually, helping businesses transform challenges into opportunities the way I'd transformed $10 and a lesson about responsibility into an empire built on the understanding that value isn't inherited, it's created. The girl who'd received $10 for Christmas had turned insult into industry, dismissal into determination, family failure into financial success that exceeded anything they'd ever dreamed possible for the child they'd decided deserved less than everyone else. Standing in my corner office overlooking Manhattan, I kept that original $10 bill framed on my desk, not as currency but as evidence. Proof that sometimes the people who value you least accidentally give you the most powerful motivation to prove them wrong about everything. 12 years later, I drove back to Greenwich in a Mercedes C-Class. Not because I needed to prove anything with German engineering, but because it was reliable, comfortable, and paid for with money I'd earned building businesses that existed, because I'd refused to accept other people's appraisal of my worth. Christmas Eve, 2027. The Colonial looked smaller than I remembered, its white columns and red brick facade unchanged but somehow diminished, like a movie set that had been impressive during childhood, but revealed its limitations once you'd seen actual architecture in cities where buildings were constructed to house dreams rather than maintain appearances. Mom answered the door wearing surprise disguised as delight, her embrace lasting exactly 3 seconds longer than politeness required, but not long enough to feel genuine. Addison, we weren't expecting you. What a wonderful surprise. Weren't expecting me. Because I'd stopped attending family celebrations after the Christmas that had taught me my exact value in their economy of affection. Because I'd spent 12 years building a life that didn't require their approval, validation, or acknowledgement to feel complete. The living room still displayed Jake's high school trophies on built-in shelves, but the BMW photos had disappeared from the mantelpiece, replaced by generic family portraits that had been professionally staged to suggest prosperity without documenting specific achievements that might invite uncomfortable questions about current circumstances. Jake sat in Dad's old recliner, his face carrying the kind of premature aging that comes from dreams deferred and expectations that had never been matched by actual accomplishments. The golden boy who'd received $40,000 for graduating college with mediocre grades now worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, driving a leased Honda Civic and living in a rented townhouse that represented the gap between family mythology and adult reality. Addison, he said, his voice carrying forced enthusiasm that couldn't quite hide the discomfort of seeing the sister he'd watched receive $10 and a lecture about responsibility now wearing clothes that cost more than his monthly salary. Good to see you. Mom mentioned you had some kind of consulting business. Some kind of consulting business. White Consulting had been featured in Forbes, Incorporated, magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. But in Jake's universe, and apparently my family's understanding, my success remained vague enough to avoid acknowledgement that might complicate their narrative about which child had been destined for achievement. Dad emerged from the kitchen carrying coffee in mugs that had been wedding gifts 30 years earlier, his movement slower than I remembered, but his expression still wearing the paternal authority that had once explained why I deserved less than everyone else in our household. Addison, sweetheart. You look well. Successful. Successful. The word hung between us like a question he wasn't quite ready to ask directly. Surrounded by living room furniture that had witnessed decades of conversations, where my achievements were minimized, and Jake's potential was celebrated, despite mounting evidence that potential without effort produces nothing except disappointment. I'd brought a card, red envelope containing a Christmas message I'd written in the same careful handwriting that had earned me academic honors they'd never displayed on their mantelpiece. Simple white paper with 12 words that had taken me years to articulate with the precision they deserved. I wanted to give you something, I said, handing the envelope to Mom with the same ceremonial gravity she'd used when presenting me with that $10 bill and lesson about financial responsibility that had inadvertently become the foundation for building an empire, worth more than they'd ever imagined possible. She opened it with the careful attention she gave to Christmas cards from relatives whose approval still mattered to her, unfolding paper that contained a single $10 bill taped to cardstock above handwritten words that would reframe everything they thought they understood about that Christmas morning 12 years earlier. Thank you for the lesson. It wasn't about money, it was about learning my worth. I had to leave to find it. Addison. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet of family gatherings where everyone understood their assigned roles. This was the silence of people realizing that narratives they'd constructed about the responsible daughter who'd learned gratitude through systematic disappointment might need significant revision. Mom's hands shook slightly as she read the card twice, her face cycling through expressions that suggested she was recalculating conversations from 12 years ago, searching for different interpretations of words that had seemed so clear when she'd whispered them to a 22-year-old daughter who'd been standing in their kitchen, holding evidence of exactly how little her family valued her achievements. Addison, Dad said, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used when delivering life lessons that had been designed to build character through acceptance of inequality. We never meant for you to feel undervalued? I finished, my voice steady with the kind of calm confidence that comes from 12 years of proving wrong people who'd confused your compliance with weakness. Unworthy? Grateful for receiving less while watching others receive more for achieving less? The math was simple now, displayed in living room furniture that told the story of choices and consequences more clearly than any family photo could have captured. Jake's BMW had been repossessed 3 years earlier, when his pharmaceutical sales hadn't generated the income necessary to maintain payments on a car he'd never earned. The trust fund had been depleted by investments in business ventures that had failed because privilege doesn't automatically generate competence. Meanwhile, the daughter they'd given $10 and a lesson about responsibility had built consulting contracts worth 8 figures annually, owned property in Manhattan that appreciated faster than most people's salaries, and employed 17 people who respected her expertise rather than her genetic credentials. This isn't revenge, I continued, looking around the living room where I'd spent 22 years trying to earn love that was always rationed based on favoritism disguised as merit. It's a reminder. You told me that $10 would teach me responsibility. You were right, it did, but the lesson wasn't what you intended. I stood up from the couch where I'd once sat listening to explanations about why Jake deserved more recognition for lesser achievements, smoothing the fabric of a dress that had cost more than their monthly mortgage, but had been purchased without debt, without co-signers, without anyone's permission except my own. The lesson was that my worth couldn't be determined by people who were too limited in their vision to recognize value when they were raising it. That sometimes the most generous gift someone can give you is proof that their love comes with conditions you're strong enough to reject. Dad's face carried the expression of someone trying to rewrite history in real time, searching for explanations that would transform 12 years of minimal contact into misunderstandings rather than consequences of systematic favoritism that had finally taught their daughter to value herself more than they'd ever valued her. But rewriting required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required admitting that maybe the daughter who'd left with $10 and a backpack had possessed vision they'd been too stubborn to see, strength they'd mistaken for neediness, potential they'd been too focused on Jake's mediocrity to recognize. I walked toward the front door, carrying car keys that represented freedom rather than gifts, independence rather than dependence, choices rather than obligations to maintain relationships with people who'd confused love with conditional approval, distributed based on birth order rather than merit. Thank you, I said. turning back to face parents who'd spent 12 years believing their daughter's absence from family celebrations had been rebellion rather than recognition that she'd outgrown the need for their validation. That Christmas morning, you gave me the only lesson I ever needed. Never let anyone else decide your worth. The Mercedes started with the quiet efficiency of machinery that had been designed by people who understood the difference between luxury and ostentation, between success and performance. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed someone who'd learned to measure achievement by personal satisfaction rather than family approval, worth by contribution rather than compliance. They'd given Jake a BMW that had been repossessed when reality met privilege without competence to support it. They'd given me $10 and unwittingly taught me that sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as disappointments that force you to build strength you never knew you possessed. Driving away from Greenwich through Connecticut snow that caught my headlights like scattered possibilities, I understood that forgiveness wasn't about absolving people who'd treated you poorly. It was about recognizing that their limitations had accidentally become your liberation. Their failure to see your value had forced you to see it yourself. The girl who'd received $10 for Christmas had learned the most valuable lesson any child can master. Your worth isn't negotiable. Your potential isn't limited by other people's vision. And sometimes walking away from people who undervalue you is the first step toward building a life that reflects what you're actually worth. If Addison's story hit you where it counts, if you've ever been the responsible child who got less while someone else got more, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who should have seen it automatically, you know exactly why this story needed to be told. This isn't just about Christmas gifts or family favoritism. It's about recognizing that sometimes the people who undervalue you accidentally give you the greatest gift possible, the motivation to prove them wrong. It's about understanding that your worth isn't determined by how others measure you. It's built by how you measure yourself. Hit that like button if you've ever turned someone else's low expectations into your highest achievements. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week, we're sharing another story about someone who transformed family dismissal into undeniable success. Share this with someone who needs to remember that being underestimated can become your greatest advantage. Comment below and tell me about a time when someone's lack of faith in you became fuel for your success, because those stories remind all of us that sometimes the best thing people can do for you is doubt you. Remember, you don't need permission from people who undervalue you to value yourself. You don't need validation from those who see you as less than to know you're more than enough. And you definitely don't need approval from family members who mistake your strength for an excuse to give you less. They gave Addison $10 and a lesson about responsibility. She turned it into millions and a lesson about self-worth.